The air in the iron yard smelled of rust and low tide, a brackish metallic perfume that clung to the damp concrete walls of the old shipping warehouse. It was the kind of industrial graveyard where intentions died quietly and bodies disappeared efficiently. Outside, the perpetual coastal fog muted the city lights, turning the world into shades of gray and shadow. Inside, under a single flickering fluorescent tube, the geometry of power was starkly displayed. She sat on a folding metal chair, cheap, unstable, rattling slightly under her negligible weight. She wore a worn nylon jacket, the kind sold in discount stores, and faded jeans. Her hair was pulled back in a severe practical bun. She looked tired. She looked insignificant. She looked exactly like the person they expected. A relative, probably a mother, certainly terrified, here to plead. Across the splintered table sat Colonel Velez. Velez wasn't a real colonel. He was a self-promoted thug, bloated on cheap liquor and the unchallenged authority of local muscle. He wore a crisp, albeit slightly stained, military-style uniform, khaki, tailored too tightly across his gut. His forearm rested casually near the polished handle of his beretta, a prop as much as a weapon. Behind him, two guards, named Reyes and Diaz, stood too close to the wall, their AKs held loosely, their posture signaling boredom and low vigilance. They had assessed the threat and downgraded it to 0. The silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic drip of condensation hitting a steel barrel nearby. Velez finally spoke, dragging his fingers through the puddle of spilled coffee on the table. His voice was a rasp, thick with contempt. Your twin brother, Marco, a regrettable necessity. He saw things he shouldn't have seen, Ms. Santos. The price for curiosity, as you know, is always negotiable, but it is never cheap. She didn't flinch. Her hands rested lightly in her lap. They were soft hands, the nails unpolished, the skin faintly scarred by domestic chores, a burn mark near the thumb, a small callus near the index finger. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that hinted at the brutal surgical efficiency they were engineered for. Velez leaned forward, his massive frame eclipsing the weak light source. The smell of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne washed over her. It was an attempt at physical intimidation, an alpha display honed in countless back rooms just like this one. He costs us time. He costs us resources. We are fair men, Ms. Santos. We do not demand the impossible. We demand the just. And the just in this city is 500,000 in unmarked bills, delivered before the morning tide. Velez punctuated the demand with a heavy sigh, as if her predicament was somehow a great inconvenience to him. You have until dawn. If you fail to meet the deadline, Marco becomes, well, irrelevant. He becomes part of the local infrastructure. Do you understand irrelevant, Ms. Santos? She met his gaze. Her eyes were a deep, unsettling brown, flat, unreadable, like polished stones at the bottom of a deep river. She hadn't blinked in nearly 60 seconds. I understand the terms, Colonel, she replied. Her voice was low, absolutely calm. It lacked the tremor of fear Velez expected, the hysteria, the begging. It was just a statement of fact, delivered by a messenger. This lack of emotion annoyed him. It undermined his performance. Velez chuckled, a wet, rattling sound in his chest. Good. We like compliance. Compliance is clean. Now tell me, Mrs. Santos, you look troubled. Is the number too high for a grieving sister? Are you worried about the banks? He paused, studying her. The lack of reaction was starting to feel wrong, like a miscalibrated machine. Let me be clear, Ms. Santos. Velez continued, his voice dropping slightly, laced with menace. We know who you are. We know you work clerical at the municipal planning office. We know you live 3 blocks from the fish market. We know you scrape by. But family is family, yes? Surely your little Marco is worth a debt or two, no? She finally moved, a subtle shift in her posture. She straightened her spine imperceptibly. It was the movement of a spring unwinding slightly, testing its tension. Reyes, the guard closest to the door, shifted his weight uncomfortably, though he couldn't have said why. Something in the air had changed, too subtle to register as a threat, but heavy nonetheless. Colonel Velez, she said, and the way she pronounced his fake rank was precise, clinical, devoid of respect. I am not troubled by the banks. She reached slowly into the inside pocket of her worn jacket. Velez's hand twitched toward his beretta. Reyes and Diaz finally leveled their rifles, the movement clumsy, reactive. Velez snarled, annoyance overriding caution. Hands where I can see them. What is that? A phone. You think you can record this, you stupid? She pulled out not a phone, not cash, but a small rectangular object wrapped tightly in gray cloth tape. It looked like a field dressing, or a poorly wrapped sandwich. Velez stared. What in God's name is that? It is what I was instructed to bring, she said. Her left hand, still resting on her thigh, made the slightest adjustment, aligning the fabric of her jeans. Velez, sensing the moment of dread, pushed back with bluster. He stood up, towering over the table. You waste my time. I will not accept your meager savings in small bills, woman. I told you 500,000. The value of the exchange is not in the money, Colonel, she interrupted, her voice still measured, still calm. It is in the compliance. She unwrapped the gray tape with agonizing slowness, peeling it back to reveal a small, dull silver ID tag. It was heavy, military-issue stainless steel, worn smooth by years of contact with skin and webbing. It was not Marco's. Velez squinted, irritated. What is this, your dog tags you served? What are you, a supply clerk? The moment hung, suspended in the greasy warehouse air. She placed the tag precisely in the center of the damp table. This is a tracking beacon, Colonel, she stated. Her eyes lifted, and for the first time Velez saw something beyond the facade of the terrified civilian. There was a calculation there, a deep, predatory focus that wiped away the tiredness, the poverty, the fear. It was the look of someone deciding the perfect place to put a blade. A beacon for who, Ms. Santos? The police. You think I fear the local constables? Velez sneered, genuinely amused. She did not answer him directly. Instead, she leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the silence like broken glass. It was a sound Reyes would later realize was the most terrifying thing he had ever heard, because it held absolute certainty. Marco, my brother, is irrelevant. That is true, but Marco is mine. And you took him into the wrong jurisdiction, Colonel. You see, the organization I work for does not deal in bank transfers. We deal in assets. And when an asset is compromised or leveraged against us, we don't negotiate for the asset's freedom. She paused, allowing the words to sink in. Velez's sneer was finally beginning to falter, replaced by a flicker of confusion and dawning unease. Reyes and Diaz were looking at each other, sensing the invisible shift in the atmospheric pressure. We simply retire the threat, she concluded. Velez felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He focused again on the dog tag. It wasn't regulation local military. It bore a faint, unrecognizable insignia, a stylized black bird caught mid-descent, and below it, a number, 744 SGT. What organization? Velez demanded, his voice now rougher, losing its authoritative edge. What does SGT mean, Sergeant? You're a sergeant of what, laundry? She didn't dignify the insult. Instead, she performed the second definitive act of the evening. She placed her right hand flat on the table, palm down, right next to the dog tag. On the back of her wrist, where her jacket sleeve had pulled up a fraction of an inch, Velez saw it. It wasn't a tattoo. It was a scar, carefully placed. 3 small, perfectly parallel lines, fused and whitened by a specific type of chemical burn used only in highly classified training regimens, the mark of the Phantom Wing Detachment. Velez gasped. It was not a voluntary sound. It was the involuntary intake of breath when the brain processes catastrophic failure. He had heard the whispers, the legends of the ghost assets, operatives so deeply buried they didn't exist in any official capacity, utilized only for the most impossible, irreparable cleanup jobs. They were myths used to scare recruits in barracks far away. But the scar was real. And the SGT, it wasn't Sergeant of Laundry. It meant Sanctioned Ghost Technician. The change in her physical form happened in the space of a single breath. The slumped shoulders vanished. The fatigue evaporated. Her posture became rigid, centered. Every muscle in her body instantly coiled and prepared. The eyes, those flat brown stones, were now calibrated sights. Velez finally understood. The mother clothes weren't a disguise. They were a safety lock. And he, in his arrogance, had just flipped the switch. He had kidnapped the civilian brother, yes, but he had activated the lethal dormant asset sister. He scrambled back from the table, knocking the metal chair over. "Guards, kill her! Now!" Reyes and Diaz were slow. They were trained to react to loud aggression to obvious physical threats. They were not trained for silence or for physics-defying speed. The sound that followed was not a shout or a gunshot. It was a snap. Before Reyes could fully cycle his AK-47 safety off, Santos's left hand moved. It didn't punch. It struck with the precision of a hammer driving a nail. She used the table as leverage, her weight shifting from her hips into a devastating low-line backhand strike, aimed not at Reyes's face, but at his temple, specifically, the point where the auditory nerve bundle meets the jaw hinge. The force was calibrated perfectly. Reyes dropped instantly, not dead but neurologically scrambled, a puppet with severed strings. He fell silently, his rifle clattering softly on the concrete. Diaz, momentarily paralyzed by the impossible speed of the takedown, finally raised his weapon, but Santos was already gone from her position. She hadn't moved around the table. She had moved through it. As Reyes fell, her right hand had plucked the Beretta from Velez's holster, not by drawing it, but by twisting the colonel's wrist and applying pressure to the nerve cluster in his forearm, causing an involuntary grip release. Velez bellowed in pain and confusion, scrambling blindly backward. Santos was now standing where Diaz expected Reyes to be. The Beretta, snatched 1 millisecond prior, was already in her hand, the movement disguised by the clutter of the table. But she didn't use the Beretta. She still needed silence. From the small of her back, where the cheap jeans had disguised a minimalist belt sheath, she drew a modified karambit, the curved, vicious blade catching the pale fluorescent light for a split second. Diaz, seeing the flash of steel, panicked and tried to fire. He missed. Santos closed the 3 feet between them in a single blurring step. She brought the karambit up under the protective vest, slicing a devastating line across the diaphragm. It was a cut designed not to kill instantly, but to paralyze the ability to breathe, forcing a gasping, silent incapacitation. Diaz dropped the AK, collapsing inward, his mouth opening in a silent, agonizing plea for air. Total time elapsed since Velez gave the kill order, 1.8 seconds. The warehouse was now silent again, save for the labored, wet breathing of Diaz and the high-pitched, pathetic whimpering of Colonel Velez. Velez was pressed against the corrugated iron wall, his uniform stained with his own urine. He looked down at the empty space where his Beretta should have been, then up at the woman who was no longer Miss Santos, the municipal clerk. She stood perfectly still, the Beretta now holstered in a speed-draw Kydex rig beneath her nylon jacket, which had somehow been partially shed and adjusted during the microseconds of action. The cheap civilian exterior was gone, replaced by the subtle outlines of a tactical harness and specialized webbing. She walked toward Velez slowly, every footstep measured and deliberate. She didn't look like a mother anymore. She looked like a highly refined instrument of destruction. 500,000, Colonel, she whispered, her voice colder than the deep Atlantic fog outside. That was the price of the exchange. You failed the transaction. You failed to respect the asset. Velez tried to talk, his throat clicking dryly. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who she was. You didn't know who Marco was, she corrected, stopping inches from him. Marco is not special. He is merely my blood. But in the world we operate in, Colonel, blood ties are not weaknesses. They are triggers. They are the failsafe that activates the ghost protocol. She reached up and brushed the stray hair from her forehead. Velez saw the faint mirror image scar pattern near her hairline. 3 more lines, identical to the ones on her wrist. The operational designation wasn't just on the dog tag. It was branded into her very existence. She pulled a thin, specialized wire from a loop inside her collar. Not piano wire, but a synthetic fiber used for high-tensile rigging. The ghost asset doctrine requires absolute, untraceable neutralization of the threat cluster. You, Colonel, represent the cluster's nucleus. Velez's eyes were wide, glossy with sheer, unadulterated horror. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of how he was about to die, at the hands of a creature he had dismissed as a nuisance. I have Marco. He's in the basement. Don't, Velez pleaded, the sound breaking off sharply. Santos leaned in, her eyes boring into his. Marco is safe. He was already extracted 20 minutes ago by my team. who followed the tracking beacon I activated upon entry. The beacon wasn't for me, Colonel. It was for them. She held up the karambit again. This time she didn't strike. She used the tip of the blade to point at the dog tag, still sitting innocently on the table. You focused on the civilian facade. You mocked the rank. You missed the designation. I am not here to negotiate Marco's release. I am here to ensure that no one associated with your militia, your cartel, or your chain of command ever considers that option again. She brought the blade down, not on Velez, but on the crisp fabric of his uniform shoulder. She sliced off the embroidered patch bearing his fake colonel insignia. In this world, Colonel, rank is nothing. Competence is everything. She tossed the patch onto the floor. Velez watched it fall. He tried one last, desperate grab for her, lunging forward with the pathetic desperation of a drowning man. Santos didn't flinch. She simply applied the garrote wire with practiced ease. It tightened instantly around his neck, severing the nerve supply to the carotid artery. There was no struggle, no gurgling, just a faint, high-pitched whimper, the final expulsion of air from a collapsing chest. Velez's large body slumped forward, hitting the concrete floor with a dead, heavy sound. Santos stood over him, the karambit already wiped clean and resheathed. She took a breath, resetting her internal clock. The transformation back to Sergeant Santos, the ghost asset, was complete. The mother facade was permanently scorched away. She scanned the room. Reyes was still breathing shallowly. Diaz was unconscious but alive. They would live just long enough to be identified and harvested for intelligence by the extraction team. The faint, distant whine of a powerful, silenced engine signaled the arrival of her backup. They were late, but they were precise. She retrieved the tracking beacon from the table and smashed it under her heel, grinding the delicate circuitry into the damp concrete. Before leaving the warehouse, she looked down at Velez's corpse. His eyes were open, fixed on the single fluorescent tube above, forever locked in the moment he understood his fatal miscalculation. He had confused exhaustion for weakness. He had mistaken silence for fear. He had focused on the uniform of a clerk and failed to see the weaponized soul beneath. She reached into the pocket of her tactical harness, not the civilian jacket pocket, but the specialized internal pocket, and pulled out a small, laminated photograph. It was of Marco, smiling, his face almost identical to hers. She paused for a moment, the barest hint of human emotion flickering across her face, quickly suppressed. The job was done. The threat was neutralized. The price had been paid not in currency but in blood and consequence. She walked toward the back exit, melting into the shadows of the iron yard, ready to disappear back into the anonymity she had been forced to abandon. The warehouse was now a tomb, a testament to the fact that when you threaten an operative's family, you don't find a bargaining chip, you find a predator. She disappeared into the fog, leaving behind only the cold metallic scent of ozone and the heavy silence of absolute power restored. If you believe respect is earned by blood and not by rank, type respect in the comments.